On an April morning in 1999, the suburb of Littleton, Colorado, looked ordinary. A maze of cul-de-sacs, tidy lawns, and the gentle hum of teenage ritual. Backpacks slung over shoulders, sneakers squeaking across linoleum floors, laughter echoing down lockers. But inside Columbine High, beneath the chatter and shuffle, something darker coiled. Two boys, smiling like every other senior, carried secrets disguised as duffel bags. At 11:19 a.m., the illusion of safety shattered. Fire alarms wailed, gunfire cracked, and a nation that thought it understood schools learned that even classrooms could bleed. What followed was not just a massacre. It was a turning point, a story that rewrote how America would look at its children, its schools, and itself. Today is not the day I die. That's what one of the boys wrote. A line scratched into a private notebook, sandwiched between rambling tirades, doodles of guns, and the kind of half-philosophical nonsense you'd expect from a teenager drunk on Nietzsche without ever finishing the book. Except this wasn't teenage melodrama. It was prophecy, self-inflicted, time-stamped, weaponized. April 20th, 1999. A date that was supposed to dissolve into the forgettable haze of suburban routine. Cafeteria pizza, overdue homework, idle gossip about who liked who. Instead, that day in Littleton, Colorado calcified into a cultural scar. Two seniors, dressed in trench coats and armed with homemade bombs and guns, walked into Columbine High School not to graduate, not to rebel, not to escape, but to annihilate. And if you peel back the neat headlines, the true horror is not just in the body count, but in the performance of it all. They filmed themselves, smirking into camcorders, like actors rehearsing lines for a play no one else asked to see. They joked, taunted, rehearsed. One leaned in, eyes gleaming, and whispered about how the world would finally understand his genius. What does it mean when death is choreographed like cinema? When the villain is also the screenwriter, the director, and the star? Columbine wasn't the first school tragedy, but it was the one that detonated in the American imagination. Before 1999, metal detectors in schools were something you saw in movies about New York. After 1999, the word Columbine itself became a synonym, a shorthand for the unspeakable. The cruelest twist? They wanted to be remembered. And here we are, decades later, still clawing at their notebooks, still playing their tapes in the dark, still arguing about whether they were monsters, martyrs, or misfits. The last words from one of their tapes echo like a riddle. We're going to kickstart a revolution. The revolution never came. Only funerals, panic drills, and anniversaries that sting like reopened wounds. But to understand why two kids born into comfort, two kids who had birthday parties, part-time jobs, and driver's licenses decided to turn their school into a war zone, you have to go deeper. Into the basement where the tapes rolled. Into the cafeteria where the bombs didn't ignite. Into the diary entries where love poems rot beside hit lists. It's not just a story about killers. It's a story about the illusion of safety, the fragility of youth, and the terrifying banality of evil when it wears the face of the boy next door. This isn't just history. It's an autopsy of a nightmare that never really ended. Suburbia is supposed to be boring. That's the point. Rows of cul-de-sacs curling like question marks into neatly trimmed lawns, the hum of garage doors, sprinkler heads ticking in unison, minivans lined up like docile cattle in driveways. In the 1990s, Littleton, Colorado, was a perfect postcard of middle-class America. Safe, predictable, the kind of place where the local mall was the epicenter of teenage life, where the loudest controversy might be over school dress code. And yet, beneath that polished surface, there was static in the air. The 90s were drunk on contradictions. Cable television brought the world into your living room, but also brought the paranoia. Stories of kidnapping, satanic cults, internet predators. It was a cultural cocktail of fear. Parents clutched the steering wheel tighter. Schools began whispering about security measures, but no one could quite imagine what was coming. Columbine High School itself looked like a fortress of modern optimism, a sprawling brick and glass complex home to over 1,900 students. Inside, trophies gleaming in display cases, classrooms buzzing with the anticipation graduation, pep rallies echoing in the gymnasium. This was supposed to be the American dream, safe, sanitized, and filled with promise. But the late 90s were restless. Youth culture was splintering into tribes. The jocks, the preps, the theater kids, the skaters, the trench coat mafia, a clique more myth than fact, later inflated by the media like a comic book villain origin story. Alternative rock blasted from bedroom stereos. Video games offered pixelated escape. And the internet, still raw, wild, and dial-up slow, was beginning to whisper dark possibilities to anyone who dared to listen. What makes Columbine so haunting isn't just that it happened in a school. It's that it happened in that school, in a place designed to be immune. The families there weren't rich, not poor, just comfortable. Police cars weren't expected to be parked outside, and the idea of mass violence belonged to action movies, not cafeterias. There was also the shadow of history lurking, invisible until hindsight turned the lights on. The shooting happened on April 20th, a date infamous in darker circles, the birthday of Adolf Hitler. Some dismissed it as coincidence. Others claimed it was deliberate symbolism. Was it carefully chosen, or was it just the cruel mathematics of chance? In the late 90s, America wanted to believe its children were safe, its communities untouched by the chaos of big cities or foreign wars. But Columbine would detonate that illusion, sending shockwaves that reshaped everything from police tactics to school architecture. Before the bombs failed, before the guns were fired, before the basement tapes were whispered into existence, Columbine was just another suburban high school. The kind of place where you were more likely to worry about acne than annihilation. And maybe that's the point. The horror wasn't imported from some faraway battlefield. It was homegrown, nurtured in the soil of everyday boredom and teenage rage, watered with neglect, fertilized by fantasy. The stage was set. The curtain was about to rise. Two names, welded together by infamy, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold. Their photos have been printed so many times. You almost forget they were once just school pictures, awkward smiles, teenage acne, shirts that hung too big on shoulders not yet finished growing. They look like kids you'd pass in a hallway and never think twice about. That, perhaps, is the cruelest disguise. Eric Harris was the architect, the one who wanted control, who fed himself on rage like a gourmet meal. His diary is a snake pit of contradictions. Hatred scrawled in capital letters, nihilistic rants about humanity's worthlessness. Then suddenly, plans, lists, diagrams. He was the kind of boy who smiled politely at parents, worked at the local pizza shop, and then went home to fantasize about building bombs in his garage. He wanted to outdo Timothy McVeigh. He didn't just want to lash out, he wanted spectacle. Dylan Klebold was different, a shadow orbiting a black hole. His writings dripped not with rage, but with sorrow, isolation, self-loathing. Where Eric burned with fire, Dylan drowned in water. Depressive, anxious, desperate for meaning. He saw himself as an outcast condemned to watch the world from outside the glass. His journal reads more like a suicide note stretched across months, longing for love, for escape, for silence. Together, they became a grotesque duet. Eric, the conductor, Dylan, the reluctant violinist. Eric wanted infamy. Dylan wanted oblivion. Alone, perhaps, they would have fizzled out. Eric jailed for pipe bombs, Dylan slipping deeper into self-destruction. But together, they metastasized into something lethal. They filmed themselves in basements, camcorders humming while they grinned, and mocked the world. They made lists of classmates they despised, joked about body counts, as if they were talking about football scores. But if you look closely at the tapes, you catch Dylan's hesitation, his quiet sighs, his eyes flickering like someone who half wants the boat out of the frame. Eric, though, Eric was locked in. He leans into the camera with the confidence of a man auditioning for eternity. And here's the paradox that gnaws at us. Before April 20th, they were not monsters. They were not supernatural forces crawling out of some cursed wood. They were kids. They laughed with friends. They bowled. They drove cars too fast. They handed in essays, played video games, worried about prom. Their teachers graded them. Their parents hugged them. Their classmates barely noticed them. That's why Columbine still stings. Because if Eric and Dylan were aliens, demons, freaks from some other planet, maybe we could file the horror away as other. But they weren't. They were ordinary enough to blend in until the very last act. And maybe that's a real nightmare. That the boy scribbling notes in math class, the kid fumbling through his locker, the one mumbling, "Have a nice day" at the pizza counter, might also be constructing the blueprint of a tragedy in his mind. The story of Columbine is not about two strangers. It's about two sons, two classmates, two faces that could have been anyone's. Every story has its rupture point. The crack in the glass that begins as a hairline and ends as shatter. For Columbine, that crack was invisible until it wasn't. It didn't begin on April 20th. It began years earlier, like a storm assembling itself far beyond the horizon. Eric Harris's writings were already boiling with contempt. He wasn't just angry at classmates. He was angry at humanity. To him, people were insects. In his journal, he mocked the idea of empathy, of weakness, of rules. He fantasized about mass destruction the way other boys fantasize about cars or girls. Dylan Klebold's disturbance took a different shape. His spiral was quieter, almost romantic in its misery. He wrote of loneliness, of wanting to disappear, of feeling like an outsider watching the entire world laugh without him. His entries weren't blueprints of conquest, but dirges, poetry written in the ink of despair. And yet, the first real rupture came not in words, but in action. A year before the massacre, Eric and Dylan were arrested for breaking into a van and stealing equipment. It should have been the kind of teenage mistake that scares you straight. Community service, mandatory counseling, probation. They smiled through it. They charmed probation officers, wrote essays about rehabilitation, played the role of reformed delinquents. No one saw the mask slipping. While they were supposed to be atoning, they were also experimenting, building pipe bombs in garages, testing small explosives in remote fields, ordering gun parts through loopholes that made the process laughably easy. At the time, it didn't register. Two teenagers tinkering with gunpowder didn't set off alarms the way it would today. Their parents didn't see. Their teachers didn't see. Their probation officers, blinded by politeness and good grades, didn't see. Then came the plans. Pages of them. Eric turned his diary into an operations manual. Bomb placements in the cafeteria, attack sequences, diversionary tactics. He envisioned the school reduced to rubble, smoke spiraling into the Colorado sky, while news helicopters broadcast his triumph. Dylan scribbled less about tactics, more about doom, almost begging the universe to explain why he should even bother living another day. The true first disturbance wasn't a crime scene. It was a cafeteria filled with students, unaware that two of their own had already decided to turn lunch hour into ground zero. It was a propane bomb hidden in a duffel bag, waiting to ignite at 11:17 a.m. That was supposed to be the grand opening. The school was meant to explode, collapsing into a firestorm before the shooting even started. The bombs didn't detonate. Malfunctions, miswiring, sheer incompetence. Call it what you will. Fate tilted the scales. But in that failure, the disturbance transformed into something even darker. Instead of pulling the trigger on a cinematic explosion, They picked up their guns and began moving through the school. And so, what was supposed to be the deadliest bombing on American soil since Oklahoma City turned into something else. The blueprint for every school tragedy that would follow. The first disturbance wasn't loud. It was quiet, plans written in ink, propane tanks disguised as lunch, smiles that fooled every adult who should have known better. The crack in the glass had already spread. No one saw it until it shattered. What's most disturbing about Columbine isn't just what happened in those 49 unbearable minutes. It's what doesn't quite fit, what resists neat packaging. You try to line up the facts like puzzle pieces, but some edges don't match. Some pieces belong to different boxes altogether. Start with a motive. Were Eric and Dylan bullied into madness? That was a story the media latched onto in the immediate aftermath. Two outcasts, mocked and humiliated, lashing back at their tormentors. It sounded almost cinematic, a tragic revenge arc for a culture addicted to underdog stories. Except it wasn't true. Multiple classmates later testified. Eric wasn't relentlessly bullied. Dylan went to prom just days before the date. They weren't complete loners, and they weren't universally hated. The myth of the bullied misfit became the public security blanket. It was easier to believe cruelty caused Columbine than confront the possibility that some kids just chose destruction. Then there's the bombs. They weren't props. They were real, functional, and chillingly ambitious. Propane tanks meant to level the cafeteria. Car bombs parked outside, timed to explode when emergency personnel arrived. This wasn't just a school tragedy. It was meant to be a domestic apocalypse. The sheer scale of their failed plan raises a question. Why wasn't it bigger? Was it incompetence? A twisted mercy? Or did they want the spectacle of shooting more than the anonymous destruction of an explosion? The witnesses add another layer of chaos. Survivors gave conflicting accounts. Trench coats, masks, extra shooters. In the panic, shadows became conspiracies. To this day, some insist there were more than two. The police reports, the timelines, the 911 calls, all tell slightly different stories, like fractured mirrors reflecting the same nightmare. And the parents, that question never dies. How did no one know? How did a house full of pipe bombs, guns, and journals brimming with violence escape detection? Eric's father was a retired Air Force pilot. Dylan's family was deeply involved in the local community. These weren't negligent households, at least not on the surface. But the basement became a sanctum of secrecy, a private theater where the most grotesque rehearsals played out unseen. Were the parents blind, or were they simply looking away? Then there's the psychology. Eric, diagnosed later, posthumously of course, by countless analysts as a clinical psychopath, manipulative, remorseless, hungry for domination. Dylan, closer to the portrait of major depression, desperate, ambivalent, longing for escape. One burned outward, one inward. So how did fire and water decide to drown the world together? What gravitational pull binds a narcissist and a depressive into a single catastrophic orbit? Every answer spawns new questions. Every explanation collapses under contradiction. Were they symbols of a violent culture or aberrations outside of it? Victims of neglect or masterminds of their own doom? Did they crave fame or oblivion? The mystery of Columbine isn't just why it happened. It's why we still don't know. Why, after thousands of pages of police reports, FBI profiles, survivor testimonies, and years of culture analysis, we're left staring at a void that refuses to give up its secret. Columbine was not just a crime. It was an echo chamber where every theory sounds right until it collides with the next one. And in that chaos, the mystery only deepens. The investigation after Columbine was like trying to stitch together a shredded manuscript. Pages missing, ink smeared, sentences contradicting each other. Law enforcement swarmed the school, and for good reason. It wasn't just a tragedy. It was a crime scene of unprecedented scale. Bodies, bombs, bullet casings, and a library drenched in silence, so heavy it still clings to the walls decades later. Police had to peel through the evidence like archaeologists excavating a ruin. In the cafeteria, 2 propane bombs sat unexploded, their timers frozen in mocking stillness. Out in the parking lot, cars were wired with gasoline bombs that never ignited. Blueprint to catastrophe, thwarted by miswiring or mechanical failure, lay scattered as proof that the intended death toll could have been 10 times higher. Then came the tapes, the infamous basement tapes. Hours of footage recorded by Eric and Dylan in the weeks leading up to the attack, stored like trophies of anticipation. In them, Eric rages like a dictator rehearsing his speeches, while Dylan mumbles like a man trapped in his own coffin. They joke about killing classmates, mock the future, fantasize about fame. Those tapes became radioactive artifacts, locked away by authorities, never publicly released. Only fragments, descriptions, and rumors seeped out. The question of why they're still sealed feeds the theories like gasoline to fire. Was it to deny the boys their twisted wish for notoriety? Or was there something in those recordings too dangerous, too contagious to let loose? Theories sprouted like weeds. Some insisted it was about bullying, a story neat enough for TV specials. Others pointed to violent video games and music, blaming Doom and Marilyn Manson for corrupting impressionable teens. Politicians seized a moment. It was a crisis of parenting, a failure of schools, a flaw in American culture, guns, goth culture, the internet. Everything became a suspect, but dig deeper and stranger threads emerge. A year before the massacre, police had been tipped off about Eric's violent website, where he wrote fantasies of killing and documented his bomb-making. A complaint was filed. A draft affidavit for a search warrant existed, but the paperwork languished in a drawer, never signed, never acted on. Had that warrant gone through, police might have found the weapon's cache. Maybe Columbine never would have happened. Other theories circled darker waters. Survivors swore they saw more shooters, silhouettes that didn't match Eric or Dylan. Conspiracies blossomed. Was there a wider network? Was Columbine just the surface of something larger? Officially, the answer was no. But when panic rewrites memory, how do you separate hallucination from hidden truth? The theories never stop multiplying because Columbine refuses to settle into a single narrative. Was it the failure of parents, of law enforcement, of society? Was it the influence of culture, or the isolated pathology of 2 disturbed boys? The investigation left us with binders of evidence, miles of transcripts, and yet a gaping wound of uncertainty. Like investigators staring at a crime scene photo too blurry to sharpen, we squint, hoping clarity will emerge. It never does. And maybe that's the darkest theory of all, that there is no single cause. Just 2 boys who, in a vacuum of meaning, built their own theater of destruction and dragged the world inside. If Columbine had ended the way Eric Harris planned, the cafeteria would have been a crater. Hundreds of students crushed under fire and smoke, the building collapsing in a headline-sized fireball. That was the script. The bombs were the crescendo, the schoolyard apocalypse. But when the propane tank stayed silent, the performance unraveled. This was the turning point. When fantasy collided with reality. Imagine it. 2 seniors standing in a cafeteria filled with ticking metal duffel bags, waiting for the explosion that would crown them as architects of chaos. Nothing. A dud. A cosmic shrug. Suddenly, their grand scheme was reduced to improvisation. Improvisation is messy. Improvisation bleeds. The chaos of April 20th spiraled because Eric and Dylan didn't walk into their school as soldiers. They stumbled in as failed bomb makers, grasping at Plan B. And Plan B meant guns, hallways, and the kind of close-range brutality that scorches itself into memory. But the breakdown wasn't just technical, it was systemic. Law enforcement surrounded Columbine, but protocol at the time dictated they wait. Secure the perimeter, call in SWAT, don't rush an active gunman. That hesitation stretched into eternal minutes. Students trapped inside dialed 911 over and over, whispering from closets, hiding under desks, bleeding out in silence. The world was listening, but rescue never came fast enough. The communication collapse was biblical in scope. Dispatchers, officers, teachers, parents, each had fragments of the story, but no one had the whole. Some believed bombs were still primed to detonate. Others thought there were multiple teams of shooters. SWAT teams crept through hallways like blind surgeons, their radios crackling with contradictions. Outside, parents waited in parking lots, staring at the building where their children were trapped, unable to do anything but scream into the void. And then the library, the climax that should never have been. A single room transformed into a slaughterhouse of panic, gunfire, and unanswered pleas. Survivors remember in fragments. A laugh, a taunt, a face leaning over a table. Time stretched, warped, disintegrated. Some escaped by sheer luck. Others were silenced forever. The turning point of Columbine isn't just the bombs failing, or the police waiting, or the media distorting the story in real time. It's the realization that every system designed to prevent disaster, from law enforcement, education, to parenting, broke under the weight of two teenagers. When the shooting finally ended, not with arrest but with self-inflicted silence, the world was left staring at the wreckage of delusions. Two boys born into the bland safety of suburbia had just dismantled the myth of safety itself. The breakdown wasn't just theirs. It was everyone's. The official ending of Columbine is grotesquely simple. At 12:08 p.m. inside the library that had already been transformed into a mausoleum, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold ended their own lives. No final showdown. No captured culprits marched out in handcuffs. Just two bodies slumped on the carpet, the architects of devastation silencing themselves before the world could interrogate them. That abrupt ending leaves a sour taste because it robs us of answers. Trials can unravel motives. Interrogations can reveal truth under pressure. But here, the only witnesses to the blueprint are the perpetrators themselves, and they took their secrets with them. All we're left were scraps. Journals, tapes, witness accounts stitched together like mismatched fabric. The official resolution declared, 2 shooters, acting alone. Case closed. But the lingering questions refused to die. Why didn't the bombs work? A matter of luck or incompetence? Was it divine intervention or just faulty wiring? Why did law enforcement fail to act faster? They claim they followed protocol, but in hindsight, those protocols seem like cruel jokes. Kids bleeding inside while heavily armed officers waited outside, fearing imaginary explosives. And then the basement tapes, still locked away. Authorities claim releasing them would inspire copycats, that Eric and Dylan's dream of posthumous fame would metastasize. But sealing them involves only fuel speculation. What's on those recordings that the public can't handle? More names? More plans? Or just unbearable proof of how disturbingly ordinary they were in their final hours? Even the question of why they did it hangs unresolved. Was it Eric's psychopathy? Dylan's depression? A toxic symbiosis? Or something larger, an echo of cultural rot, a reflection of violence simmering beneath America's glossy suburban skin? Some survivors and families believe the why doesn't matter, that no explanation can balance the scale of what was lost. Others obsess, digging through evidence like archaeologists, convinced that if they could just find a missing shard, the story will make sense. But maybe Columbine's most haunting trait is its refusal to make sense. It resists resolution like a riddle designed to stay unsolved. It doesn't close, it festers. The official ending was 2 bodies on a library floor. The real ending is harder to pin down, because Columbine never really ended. It lingers in every lockdown drill, Every news alert of another school tragedy, every anniversary, where the footage plays again and again like a curse on repeat. The case is closed. The questions are not. The smoke cleared. The crime scene tape was torn down. The funerals were held. But Columbine never ended. It metastasized. It bled into every classroom, every school hallway, every whispered parent's prayer that it can't happen here. Before 1999, fire drills were the norm. After 1999, lockdown drills became as routine as algebra homework. Children crouching under desks, teachers barricading doors with bookshelves, rehearsing survival against invisible enemies. That was Columbine's true inheritance. The media legacy was its own beast. Endless footage of terrified students fleeing the school, hands above their heads, looped on television screens until it burned into memory. The 24-hour news cycle found its muse in Columbine. Reporters filled airtime with speculation, trenchcoat cults, gothic conspiracies, Marilyn Manson lyrics, doomed video games. None of it true, but all of it sticky enough to linger. The killers became cultural anti-heroes in the darkest corners of the internet. Their journals dissected like scripture, their faces plastered across websites as if notoriety was a prize. For survivors, the aftermath was quieter but crueler. Lifelong injuries, both visible and invisible. Anxiety, survivor's guilt, PTSD. Students who crawled out of school with blood on their clothes grew into adults who still flinch at the sound of fire alarms. Parents carried the impossible weight of birthdays that would never come. Some survivors turned to advocacy, becoming voices for reform. Others vanished into private grief, refusing to let their pain be consumed by the public. Law enforcement changed, too. Active shooter response protocols were rewritten overnight. No more waiting outside, no more slow containment. Officers would now be trained to rush toward gunfire, to stop the killing first, save lives second. Columbine's delay had cost too much, and no department wanted to repeat it. Even architecture shifted. Schools redesigned entryways, installed cameras, employed armed officers. The suburban high school, once a symbol of innocence, began resembling a fortress. Safety became spectacle. Clear backpacks, metal detectors, drills, panic buttons. And yet, despite all these changes, Columbine's legacy is poisoned by repetition. Instead of ending the cycle, it became the prototype. Every time another school is attacked, headlines reach for the same word: another Columbine. The tragedy carved itself so deeply into the cultural lexicon that it became shorthand, a grim reference point, a dark milestone against which every subsequent horror is measured. Perhaps the cruelest legacy is this: Eric and Dylan want to be remembered, and they were, but not as they imagined. They are not revolutionaries. They are not prophets. They are symbols of a wound that never healed, of a story replayed so many times that it became a template. Columbine didn't just scar a community. It rewired the nation. There's a grotesque irony buried in Columbine's ashes. Eric Harris wanted a legacy of fire, and Dylan Klebold wanted an escape from his own head, and both got what they didn't ask for. Eric's revolution fizzled into a string of botched explosives, and a final act so muddled it barely resembled strategy. Dylan's longing for oblivion left him etched into memory forever, remembered not as a boy who wanted to disappear, but as half a myth that refuses to fade. Maybe that's the bitter truth of Columbine. It's not a riddle to be solved, but a mirror. Every time you stare into it, you see something different. Failures of parenting, policing, media, culture. Or maybe you see nothing at all, just two boys with too much emptiness inside, filling it with fire and bullets. The horror is in that emptiness. The horror is that there's no neat story arc, no lesson gift wrapped in tragedy. Just silence in a library that once echoed with gunfire. And still, the questions linger like smoke. What if the search warrant had been signed? What if the bombs had worked? What if one parent had opened a drawer? One friend had spoken louder? One officer had moved faster? What if? That endless chorus is Columbine's soundtrack. The temptation is to mythologize, to turn Eric and Dylan into monsters or martyrs or metaphors. But they were just boys. Boys who laughed, boys who lied, boys who turned their private abyss outward and swallowed a community whole. And that's what unsettles us most, that the monsters didn't crawl from shadows. They sat in classrooms, ate lunch in cafeterias, joked with friends. Columbine is not just a date on a calendar. It's a rupture, a reminder that safety is fragile, that ordinary can hide extraordinary terror, that tragedy doesn't need a grand reason to arrive. It just needs two people willing to drag their pain into the daylight and force everyone else to live in its shadow. So maybe the final reflection is this. The boys wanted fame, but what they created was a curse. A word that still makes hearts stop. A script that others, tragically, would copy. A question that has no satisfying answer. And perhaps that's what makes Columbine eternal. Not the numbers, not the names, but the gnawing uncertainty it left behind. A wound without a scab. A silence that still screams. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next case.